Thank you very much, Elaine. That is quite a cleaver that you have in your kitchen there. I'll be sure to be careful around it when you've got it in your hand. But I want to say, first of all, thank you very, very much for asking me to join you today. Good morning from London. A good afternoon and good day wherever you happen to be. And I want to say a big hello to all of my friends and colleagues and collaborators on the other panels and the other sessions throughout today, and no doubt listening in. One day we'll do this again in person. I can't really wait for it, but it's great to be here in whatever way I can. And thank you very much for the introduction. I won't dwell too much on, the sort of the GSSB, except to say, as Elaine said, that it's the independent governance body under the Global Reporting Initiative, which is responsible for developing and setting the GRI standards. And it's an independent body constituted in the public interest. Like everything under GRI, it reflects a multi-stakeholder process. And it's a great privilege to be part of this work. I've been asked to reflect on a few key questions about governance in sustainability reporting, which I've done. And I hope we'll also have a bit of time to hear some of your thoughts and questions on the subject. Please use the Q&A. I'll do my best as far as I can to get to questions in the Q&A box. And then, as Elaine said, we do have a very distinguished panel coming up afterwards to hear in a lot more depth from people who get their hands dirty in the kitchen, I think, with some of these disclosures. Okay, so for the first thing that I've been asked to sort of think about a little bit is why and how is the requirement for enhanced governance disclosures in sustainability reporting changing? And I want to talk about this. This is a long answer, by the way. The others are much shorter, so don't worry too much. I'm not going to carry on that long. I'm sure that others have offered their view on this in other conference sessions, but I want to reflect for just a moment on the nature of the G in ESG. Because for investors, the G has long been a big focus. And the reason is understanding governance is necessary to developing a sense of confidence in a business's capabilities to deal with challenges that we may not be able to predict very well. So the mainstream discussion of corporate governance has reflected this understanding. And that's why there's so much investor discussion of the roles of boards, separation of board chair and CEO, risk management, and other related issues. And when we overlay this with the nature of sustainability issues and practices, the picture gets very complex. A company's sustainability impacts and strategies really encompass almost everything that a company does. And while some, or many, or maybe even most of these have a defined location inside of a company, a clear, a well-understood boundary of activities and a clear and tangible ways of measuring performance, a great many of these challenges do not. And instead, we need organizations to be prepared to avoid risks where they can and to face challenges effectively whenever they arise. I want to just point out, people are generally not very good at predicting the challenges that confront business. Many of you will be familiar with the World Economic Forum Global Risk Map, which is published every January at the time of their big event in Davos in Switzerland. This is a survey of CEOs and senior executives of businesses around the world who are asked to rank a series of issues in terms of their potential severity and their likelihood of occurrence. And then this is published as a composite view of global business as to the risks that we are facing and that business needs to be prepared for. So in the risk map that was published in January of 2020, the topic of global pandemic was included as one of the risks to be ranked. And these titans of industry collectively ranked the potential impact of global pandemic risk as moderately high and the likelihood of occurrence as not very likely. At the time of publication, I just want to point out this was January of 2020. Chinese cities were in serious lockdown conditions, and the rest of the world was mere weeks away from this. And vast numbers of businesses were entirely unprepared, and we still haven't recovered. I flag this example because, in a sense, the global pandemic risk should, in theory, be one of the easiest to consider because it has happened repeatedly throughout history. And yet virtually none of the businesses, virtually every business was caught off guard. I make this point because this is what governance is actually for. If you were to take out global pandemic and swap in climate change, well, the world has never seen the impacts of uncontrolled global heating, contrary to pandemic. And for individual organizations to predict the effects of global climate change for each of their operations in various locations, supply chains, their customers and markets, and the global financial system, well, we may know a lot about the fundamental science of climate change, but no business has an action plan that deals with all the contingencies. It's really impossible to create this. And similarly, for the topic of human rights, it's not acceptable to address human rights abuses solely after the fact, because, of course, there's no amount of human rights violation that can be considered tolerable or manageable. It's not feasible or effective for an organization to try to predict which specific people are at risk from day to day of specific human rights violations, especially if they're several tiers away in the supply chain. So therefore, businesses must create the conditions that will make responsible behavior likely and the norm, and will seek out and actively address these occurrences when they do happen. Because it is impossible to predict the future, we need organizational leadership that is prepared to face unknown situations and respond with integrity. We need boards that ask tough questions and seek out challenge from management and outside experts, and that employees, shareholders, neighbors, and governments can rely on to do the right thing. This is what governance does, and why the governance stakes in terms of sustainability are so high. In fact, Amita Chowdhury talked about the chief sustainability officer as being the man in the crow's nest on the ship, scanning the horizon, looking for the changes. I put it to you that the broader structures and methodologies around corporate governance very much support this and add to this capability. So turning now to governance disclosures in sustainability reporting, this is indeed evolving. We see ever-growing numbers of companies disclosing more detail about structure and processes that are related to these matters. And this is being amplified by key institutions signaling to companies that more transparency is needed on this matter. So for example, the International Corporate Governance Network's recently updated governance principles highlight specific accountability for the governance of sustainability for global businesses. And the UNPRI, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, their work with investors to articulate the importance of some of the specific sustainability governance issues, including executive pay, tax avoidance, corruption, and cybersecurity, among other things, in governance disclosure. So reflecting all of this, the GRI Universal Standards, which I know you've just heard about from Peter Paul van der Wijs, have been revised to align with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct, among other instruments. And the actual governance disclosure expectations in the GRI standards have evolved as well, building on ICGN's and PRI's work, among others. The disclosures in the revised GRI standards provide information about the organization's governance structure, composition, knowledge, roles, remuneration, and the information reported under these disclosures is important for understanding how the management of the organization's impacts on the economy, environment, and people, including impacts on their human rights, is integrated into the organization's strategy and operations. They address how the governance bodies are set up and how well equipped they are to oversee the management of the organization's impacts. And the disclosures also facilitate an understanding of the role and responsibilities of governance bodies with respect to these impacts. So turning now to the question, Is corporate governance disclosure content in annual reports and proxies enough to meet the needs of sustainability-focused stakeholders? My simple answer to this is no. In some ways, this is because annual reports, which, let's remember, they are normally very heavily regulated documents. Annual reports are traditionally designed to meet the needs of investors in their narrow scope as providers of capital. And the annual report has, for the most part, not kept up with this evolving understanding of corporate governance and its relationship to sustainability impacts, even to the extent that investors are driving the debate. So disclosures on governance that are based on these customs, on governance codes and listing requirements in many countries are often lacking evidence of how a company is, from a structural and process perspective, prepared to deal with sustainability matters. While the field is still evolving, most existing governance disclosure arrangements are insufficient at this point to meet the needs of sustainability-minded stakeholders, and they simply don't treat sustainability issues, risks, and responsibilities in any depth. On the other hand, in the new GRI Universal Standards, we have incorporated fundamental concepts of responsible business practice into the heart of the governance disclosures for all organizations, including things like the organization's policy commitments for responsible business conduct, including their policy commitment to respect human rights, and how the commitments are embedded throughout the organization's activities and business relationships, grievance mechanisms and other remediation processes in place, their engagement with affected and potentially affected stakeholders. Lastly, I just want to say a few words in relation to the question of why are governance disclosures so challenging for sustainability reporting? And what are the elements of governance disclosure that every sustainability report should include? Well, we do hear this quite frequently, that governance is challenging and it is perceived to be something that presents a real issue for responsible organizations. But in principle, they shouldn't really be. Because the governance disclosure in sustainability reporting should allow the organization to reflect on their preparedness to deal with sustainability matters, the impacts of business activities on the economy, environment, and people, as well as risk and opportunities. The fact is that most companies are really at the beginning of the journey when it comes to organizing their accountability for the governance of sustainability matters. And it's important to note that governance disclosure can be built over time and can be used to tell the story of how the organization is reorganizing its structure and processes, how it attracts the right competencies to meet the rising expectations. Peter Paul reflected on this as well. It isn't, you don't have to start with the finished product. You know, it is a process that evolves over time. And I think that is something that's expected by most stakeholders and can be easily reflected in sustainability reporting. I should say here that this sort of reporting is hugely engaging for many stakeholders, including employees, investors, and civil society, and it's a massive contributor to building trust. There's often resistance within companies to embracing these levels of transparency, and I think that's really where the challenge comes from. Remuneration ratios are a good example. GRI includes some disclosures about pay ratios, for example, between the top and the rank and file of companies. Overcoming those misgivings is probably the real challenge that practitioners who are charged with corporate and sustainability reporting face. For this reason, it's essential to demonstrate how important these matters are considered in international best practice, where leading organizations such as the ICGN and UNPRI have been so active and visible. I think you've probably heard enough from me about the, sort of my views, my context on some of these ideas, and I'd like to turn it back now to let us open up the panel. But as I say, please, if there are, we'll try to take some questions in the Q&A as we go along.